January 27, 1944. Novgorod. The old woman stands at what remains of her window, gripping the frame with both hands. Outside, in the frozen street below, something moves. Not the gray-green uniforms she has learned to fear for 2.5 years. Brown. Soviet brown. Her breath catches. She doesn't call out, doesn't wave. For a long moment, she simply stands there, her face completely still, watching Red Army soldiers move past rubble that was once her neighbor's home. One of them glances up. Their eyes meet. He's young, perhaps 20, with a face weathered beyond his years. He nods once, then continues forward, rifle held across his chest. She steps back from the window. Her hands are shaking now. After 900 days, after everything, they've come back. But this moment, this first glimpse of liberation, isn't what anyone expected. Not the woman at the window. Not the soldiers in the street. Not the thousands of civilians emerging from basements and shelters across newly freed Soviet territory. Because liberation in the East wasn't like liberation in France or Belgium. There were no flowers thrown, no champagne bottles opened, no embraces in sunlit squares. There was silence. There was ash. There was the weight of what had been lost and what could never be recovered. To understand what happened when the Red Army returned, you need to understand what Soviet civilians had endured. The German invasion of June 1941 had swept across Soviet territory with unprecedented speed and brutality. Within months, the Wehrmacht controlled vast swaths of Soviet land: Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, the Baltic states. Millions of Soviet citizens found themselves under Nazi occupation. What followed wasn't military occupation as understood in Western Europe. Operation Barbarossa came with explicit racial ideology. General Plan Ost, the Nazi blueprint for the East, called for the elimination, enslavement, or expulsion of the Slavic population. Soviet civilians weren't simply conquered. They were designated for destruction. The numbers tell part of the story. Of the roughly 27 million Soviet citizens who died during the war, the majority were civilians. In Belarus alone, the Germans destroyed 209 cities and towns and more than 9,000 villages. 1 in 4 Belarusians died. In Ukraine, entire communities vanished. Babi Yar, Katyn, names that became synonyms for massacre. Those who survived faced systematic starvation, forced labor, public executions. In Leningrad, the siege lasted 872 days. People ate wallpaper paste, leather belts, anything. The dead lay in the streets through winter. In occupied territories, civilians watched neighbors dragged away for partisan activity, real or imagined. They watched public hangings meant to terrorize. They watched their homes burned, their churches destroyed, their lives reduced to simple survival. And then, beginning in late 1942 after Stalingrad, the tide turned. Slowly, brutally, at immense cost, the Red Army pushed west. They recaptured Stalingrad in February 1943. Kursk in July. By autumn, they crossed the Dnieper. By winter, they were liberating major cities. For civilians in occupied zones, news of the Soviet advance came in whispers, in smuggled leaflets, in the sudden nervousness of German troops. Hope warred with fear. Yes, the Red Army was coming back. But what would liberation actually mean? What would the soldiers find? What would they think of those who survived? And what would those soldiers, hardened by years of the most savage warfare in human history, do when they saw what had been done to their homeland? Anatoly Kuznetsov was 13 when the Red Army liberated Kiev in November 1943. He later wrote about standing in the ruins of his street, watching the tanks roll in. The soldiers looked nothing like the fresh-faced troops in the propaganda posters he remembered from before the war. These men were gaunt, filthy, wrapped in whatever kept them warm. Their faces, he wrote, looked like they belonged to men who had seen things that aged them beyond measure. The tanks stopped. Soldiers dismounted. And then something unexpected happened. They stood still. Not advancing, not celebrating. Just standing, looking at what remained of the city. An officer removed his cap. Others followed. They stood there in the frozen street, surrounded by ruins, and they wept. This scene repeated across the liberated territories, in variations that all shared the same core elements. The soldiers arrived. They saw the destruction, and they stopped. In Novgorod, Red Army troops entered a city that had held 40,000 people before the war. They found 51 civilians. 51. The city had been systematically demolished, building by building. Ancient churches that had stood for centuries were rubble. The famous Novgorod Kremlin was gutted. When soldiers moved through the ruins, they found messages scratched on walls by civilians before they were deported or killed. Names. Dates. Final words. The liberating troops had expected damage. They'd fought through devastated villages and towns for months. But the scale of the destruction in Novgorod broke something in them. Officers filed reports describing soldiers who wouldn't speak for hours after entering the city. Men who sat in the ruins and stared at nothing. Men who, when they finally did speak, asked the same question over and over. Why? Why do this to a city? For the civilians who had survived, the soldiers' reactions meant something profound. After years of being told by German propaganda that they were subhuman, that their lives meant nothing, here were Soviet soldiers weeping for what had been done to them. Here were men who had fought their way across hundreds of miles of devastated country stopping to grieve. Maria Savchenko survived the occupation of her village in Ukraine. When the Red Army arrived, she expected, she didn't know what. Anger, perhaps, that they had lived under German rule. Suspicion. Instead, the first soldier she spoke to, a young sergeant from Georgia, asked if she had food. She shook her head. He gave her half his ration. She tried to refuse. He insisted. "You've been hungry long enough," he said. Then he asked about her family. She told him, father dead in the first month of occupation, mother and sister taken for labor in Germany, brother fled to the partisans, whereabouts unknown. The sergeant wrote it all down in a small notebook. "We'll help you find them," he said. She didn't believe him. How could they? But he wrote it down anyway, as if it mattered, as if she mattered. But liberation wasn't uniform. It wasn't universally gentle or compassionate. The Red Army that returned was not the Red Army that had retreated in 1941. These soldiers had seen their comrades killed in the millions. They'd found evidence of atrocities everywhere they advanced. Mass graves, burned villages, testimony from survivors about what the Germans had done. Some came back to their own towns and found everyone they knew dead. That creates something in soldiers that doesn't fade with victory. In some places, Soviet troops entering liberated territory were brutal. Anyone suspected of collaboration faced immediate consequences. Women who had relationships with Germans were publicly humiliated, heads shaved, sometimes worse. Men who had worked for the occupation administration were arrested on sight. NKVD units followed the advancing army, screening returnees, looking for traitors, finding them everywhere. Yevgenia Kiselyeva returned to her apartment in Kharkov after liberation. She'd hidden in the countryside during occupation. When she came back, she found Soviet officers going through her belongings. They questioned her for hours. Where had she been? How had she survived? Why had she left the city? Every answer led to more questions. The underlying accusation hung unspoken in the room. How do we know you weren't working with them? She wasn't arrested. Many were. The Soviet state's paranoia about collaboration was intense and often indiscriminate. Survive the German occupation? Suspicious. Return from German labor camps? Suspicious. Live through the siege of Leningrad? Why didn't you fight harder? The liberation came with judgment. And yet, alongside that darkness, there were moments of profound humanity. Lieutenant Boris Polvoy, a war correspondent with the Red Army, described entering a village in Belarus where German troops had massacred most of the population. The survivors, mostly women, children, and elderly men, emerged from the forest when they saw Soviet tanks. A woman in her 60s approached Polvoy. She said nothing. She simply reached out and touched his sleeve, as if confirming he was real. Then she said, "You came back. We thought you'd forgotten us." Polvoy, a man who had seen years of war, wrote that he couldn't respond. His throat had closed. All he could do was nod. In Leningrad, when the siege was finally broken in January 1944, soldiers from the relief forces entered the city and saw what starvation had done. Bodies everywhere, frozen where they'd fallen. Survivors who looked like walking skeletons. Buildings pocked with shell damage, windows shattered, no heat, no light. The soldiers had brought supplies, food, medicine, warm clothing. They distributed it all and then requisitioned more from their own stocks. Officers gave up their rations. Soldiers gave up their coats. When asked why, one lieutenant said, "Because they held. They held and we failed them in 41. This is the least we can do." The question of collaboration haunted liberation. Soviet authorities believed that anyone who had survived under German occupation might have collaborated. Entire populations came under suspicion. Returning Red Army soldiers who had been prisoners of war were interrogated, many sent to gulags. The message was clear: survival under occupation required explanation. This created a terrible dynamic for civilians. They had survived years of German brutality. Now they faced Soviet suspicion. A woman in Minsk described it as feeling like she was on trial for not dying. She'd hidden in a basement, scavenged food, avoided German patrols, and survived. But to Soviet authorities, her survival was evidence of something sinister. She must have cooperated. She must have betrayed someone. Why else would the Germans let her live? For some, liberation brought reunion. Families separated by the chaos of war found each other. Soldiers from liberated regions learned that relatives had survived. These moments of joy stood out against the overwhelming devastation. Viktor Nekrasov, a Soviet officer, described watching a soldier learn his mother was alive. The man had believed her dead for 2 years. When told she'd survived in a partisan camp, he sat down in the mud and put his face in his hands. He didn't make a sound. His shoulders shook. After a long time, he stood up, straightened his uniform, and asked where she was. He walked 12 kilometers through snow to see her that night. But for every reunion, there were dozens of confirmations of death. Soldiers returned to their home villages to find nothing. Families waited for relatives who would never return. The Red Army's advance meant liberation, but it also meant knowledge. Final, terrible knowledge of who was gone. The civilians who survived described a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly. The Germans were gone. The immediate threat of execution, starvation, deportation had ended. But relief mixed with guilt. Why had they survived when so many hadn't? Mixed with grief for everything lost. Mixed with fear of what came next. Mixed with exhaustion so profound that some people simply sat down and couldn't get up. A doctor in Kiev described treating civilians in the days after liberation. Their physical ailments were severe: malnutrition, disease, untreated wounds. But what struck her most was their emotional state. They didn't celebrate. They didn't cry. They seemed numb, moving through the motions of survival without connection to what it meant. It was as if, she wrote, they were still waiting for something worse to happen. They couldn't quite believe it was over. And in many ways, it wasn't over. The Germans might be gone, but the war continued. Men of fighting age were conscripted immediately. Women were mobilized for labor battalions. The Red Army needed to replace casualties, and liberated territories were a source of manpower. So liberation often meant saying goodbye to sons, brothers, husbands who had just returned or been found alive. The embrace of reunion followed immediately by the grief of separation. In some towns, the Germans had time to prepare for retreat. They implemented scorched earth policies, destroying anything of value. Food stores burned, wells poisoned, livestock shot, houses demolished. They wanted to leave nothing for the Soviets, military or civilian. This meant that liberation sometimes brought people to cities and villages that could no longer sustain life. No food, no shelter, no infrastructure. The civilians who had survived occupation now faced starvation in liberation. Soviet authorities worked to address this, but resources were scarce and priorities military. Food convoys meant for civilians were often diverted to the front. Rebuilding was delayed indefinitely. People lived in ruins, sometimes literally in the basements of destroyed buildings, through the winter of 1944. They had survived the Germans. Now they had to survive the aftermath. In the days and weeks following liberation, Soviet authorities began the process of restoration and retribution. NKVD teams fanned out across freed territories, conducting investigations. They documented German atrocities, gathering evidence for future war crimes trials. Mass graves were exhumed and bodies counted. Witness testimony was recorded. The scale of the killing was becoming clear. Simultaneously, they hunted collaborators. Anyone who had held any position under German administration was arrested and interrogated. Police, administrators, translators, even people who had worked in German kitchens or cleaned German offices. The definition of collaboration was broad and the penalties severe. Some faced execution. Others faced decades in the Gulag. Many were guilty of survival, nothing more. For ordinary civilians, life became about reconstruction. Women formed work brigades to clear rubble, restore roads, plant crops. Children were mobilized to help. Everyone worked because there was no alternative. Soviet propaganda emphasized heroic reconstruction, the unstoppable will of the Soviet people. The reality was exhausted people with no resources doing backbreaking labor because if they didn't, they'd starve. Schools reopened, though often without buildings, books, or trained teachers. Classes met in basements, in partially destroyed houses, anywhere with a roof. Education continued because the Soviet state demanded it, but also because it represented normalcy. If children were in school, perhaps life could eventually return to something resembling normal. Churches, where they hadn't been completely destroyed, became gathering points. The Soviet state's official atheism hadn't eliminated religious faith, and occupation had intensified it. People came to damaged churches to pray, to mourn, to mark the passage from occupation to liberation. Priests who had survived conducted services, often without permission, for congregations desperate for ritual and meaning. The emotional processing happened slowly, unevenly. Some people were able to cry, to express grief, to begin coming to terms with loss. Others remained numb for months, years. Post-traumatic stress wasn't understood or acknowledged. People were simply expected to move forward, to rebuild, to contribute to the war effort. There was no time or space for psychological wounds. Letters became lifelines. People wrote to the Red Army, to government offices, to anyone who might have information about missing relatives. Did anyone see my husband? Did anyone know what happened to my daughter? The desperate hope that perhaps, somehow, someone was still alive somewhere drove thousands of these letters. Most went unanswered. Some brought the closure of confirmed death. A few brought miracles, news that someone had survived, was in a hospital, was in a camp, was coming home. The liberation of Soviet territory was a military turning point. By early 1944, the Red Army had recaptured most of the occupied zones. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states would all be freed by mid-1944. Each advance brought more evidence of what had happened under occupation and hardened Soviet resolve. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, liberated Belarus. It was one of the largest Soviet operations of the war, involving 2.3 million soldiers. The offensive destroyed German Army Group Center, killed or captured roughly 400,000 German soldiers, and pushed the front line westward toward Poland. For the civilians of Belarus, it meant liberation from an occupation that had killed 1 in 4 of them. The evidence of German atrocities documented during liberation shaped Soviet war policy. Stalin and the Soviet leadership saw the systematic nature of the killing. The Einsatzgruppen massacres, the starvation policies, the deliberate destruction of Soviet cultural sites. This wasn't the fog of war or unfortunate civilian casualties. This was planned annihilation. This understanding drove the Red Army's behavior as it pushed into German territory in 1945. Soviet soldiers had seen what the Germans did to their homeland. When they entered East Prussia, they brought that knowledge with them. The atrocities committed by Soviet forces against German civilians in the final months of the war, and they were real and terrible, cannot be separated from what those soldiers had witnessed in their own occupied territories. The liberation also revealed the Soviet Union's demographic catastrophe. Entire generations of young men were dead. Millions of civilians were gone. Cities that had held hundreds of thousands now counted populations in the thousands or hundreds. The Soviet Union would take decades to recover, if it ever truly did. The scars of occupation and liberation marked Soviet society for generations. For Western allies, the liberation of Soviet territory provided stark evidence of Nazi racial ideology in practice. When Western journalists and military observers entered newly liberated areas, they saw the scale of destruction and killing. The reports they filed influenced Allied policy, strengthened resolve for unconditional surrender, and contributed to the decision to prosecute Nazi leadership for crimes against humanity. The experience of occupation and liberation shaped post-war Soviet identity. The Great Patriotic War became central to Soviet national mythology. The suffering, the resistance, the triumph over fascism, these became foundational stories. Every town had its memorial to those who died. Every family had its losses. The war wasn't history. It was lived memory, renewed every year on Victory Day. But the darker aspects, the collaboration trials, the deportations of entire ethnic groups accused of collaboration, the suspicion directed at survivors and POWs, these were less discussed. The official narrative emphasized heroism and sacrifice. The complexity of liberation, with its mixture of genuine relief and state-imposed judgment, was simplified into triumphant story of restoration. Anatoly Kuznetsov, the boy who watched the Red Army return to Kiev, spent decades processing what he'd witnessed. He wrote about occupation, about liberation, about the moral complexity of survival. In his work, he tried to capture something that Soviet censors wanted forgotten. That liberation was complicated, that it brought relief but also judgment, freedom but also fear. Maria Savchenko, the Ukrainian woman who received half a ration from a Georgian sergeant, never saw him again. She didn't know his name, but she remembered that gesture of humanity amid devastation. Years later, she would tell her grandchildren about it, about the soldier who saw her as human when the world had tried to make her less than that. The woman at the window in Novgorod, her name was Klavdia Nazarova. She was 63 when the Red Army returned. She had survived by hiding in a basement, by scavenging, by being invisible. When Soviet officers interviewed her, they asked how she survived. She couldn't fully explain it. The randomness of who lives and who dies in war. They noted her name in a registry of survivors and moved on. She lived another 20 years, in a rebuilt Novgorod that looked nothing like the city she'd known. She never left. For the Red Army soldiers who liberated these territories, the experience marked them permanently. They had fought through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through countless smaller battles. They had seen their comrades die in vast numbers. But entering liberated Soviet cities and seeing what the occupation had done, that was different. That was personal. They were fighting for abstract concepts before: the motherland, socialism, Stalin. Now they were fighting for something concrete: revenge for what was done, justice for those who suffered, restoration of what was destroyed. Lieutenant Boris Polvoy, the war correspondent who described the woman who touched his sleeve, continued forward with the Red Army all the way to Berlin. He documented the liberation of Auschwitz. He witnessed the final assault on the Reichstag. And he wrote that nothing he saw in those final months of the war affected him as deeply as that moment in the Belarusian village when a survivor reached out to confirm he was real. "We came back," he wrote. "But what we found when we returned was beyond what anyone could make right. We could win the war. We couldn't win back what was lost." That became the tragedy of liberation in the East. Victory, yes. Triumph over fascism, yes. But at such cost that the victory itself felt hollow. The people celebrated in Victory Day parades, waved flags, honored the fallen. And beneath the celebration was grief that never fully healed. The children who survived grew up knowing they were the lucky ones, raised by grandparents because parents were dead, in cities rebuilt on rubble. They were told to be proud of Soviet victory. They were proud. But they also carried knowledge of what that victory required. Soviet civilians who experienced liberation described it not as a single moment, but as a long, complex process of returning to life. The Germans left. The Red Army arrived. And then there was everything that came after. The questioning, the rebuilding, the mourning, the slow reconstruction of something resembling normal existence. For many, the moment of liberation wasn't when the first Soviet soldier appeared. It was weeks or months later. The first time they slept without fear, the first meal that left them satisfied, the moment they realized they might actually survive. Liberation was gradual, unfolding in stages, each marked by small reclamations of humanity. Others never felt fully liberated. The war's psychological weight, the losses suffered, the suspicion they faced as survivors, the trauma of what they'd witnessed, these didn't end with the German retreat. They carried them forward through decades of Soviet life, through Reconstruction, through the Cold War, through the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The old woman at the window, watching that first Soviet soldier in the street, didn't know any of this yet. She didn't know about the interrogations, the trials, the deportations. She didn't know about the decades of rebuilding ahead. She didn't know that normal would never truly return, that life after liberation would be building something new rather than restoring what was lost. In that moment, all she knew was that they had come back. After 900 days, after everything the occupation had taken, the Red Army had returned. Not as liberators from another country, celebrated with flowers and champagne, but as fellow Soviets, returning to their own ravaged homeland, seeing what had been done, and weeping for it. That was liberation in the East. Not joyful, though relief was real. Not simple, though the Germans' departure was welcome. But marked by the weight of survival, by grief for what was lost, by the hard work of continuing forward when so much had been destroyed. The Soviet civilians who lived through it carried that weight for the rest of their lives. And in their silence, in their numbness, in their determination to rebuild despite everything, they honored both the dead and the terrible cost of victory.